All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here on a busy and also beautiful fall afternoon. I'm delighted to have so many friends from SUNY and outside of SUNY joining us today. I'm Katherine Clark-Walter. I'm a medieval historian. I teach medieval and ancient history in the history department at SUNY Brockport. It is just a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I really also want to thank Lynn Hines McCoy, who's made everything possible. And she's been that person that when, we ask, she'll say, well, we're going to have a Q&A. And then someone will say, well, how are we going to do questions? She's been that person who smiles patiently and has guided us through every step of the process and has really facilitated our project. I just wanted to say a little bit about the History Lab. It is the brainchild of my colleague here at SUNY Brockport, Michael Kramer, who obtained a SUNY T2G grant to get a bunch of us together to create initially a series of webinars and then perhaps something larger to link historians through SUNY, historians in all disciplines and with all different interests and emphases in history. And so he has run a series of webinars in American history, and I am just proud that we are the initiating flagship webinar for European and world history. So I'm really happy that Laura was excited to hear about this and engaged Lois to do the introductions. So that's just a little bit about why we're here and why it's really great that we're all putting in our time to hear about each other's work and come together across different institutional lines. It's my pleasure to introduce Lois Honeycutt. She has said, this is all we need to know. She said Lois Honeycutt received her PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara, where she was mentored by Warren Hollister, Jeffrey Russell, and Sharon Farmer. Her work is concentrated on the Anglo-Norman world, particularly the study of queens named Mathilda. So great she's with us today. But her queenship studies have also led her to comparative studies of 12th century royal women in Spain, Jerusalem, France, and Georgia. I'm really excited that Lois and Laura, you have such a great connection and you have read Laura's book and are just here to lead us into what's going to be a fascinating chat. So thanks for being with us.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for inviting me because I was delighted to accept this invitation, this honor of introducing my colleague and friend, Laura, not least because it actually gave me access to a pre-publication copy of the book. And it is, not surprisingly, from Laura, an innovative, authoritative, erudite, and utterly delightful book to read. And the fact that Laura begins the introduction by citing inspiration from a study of 19th century American slavery, which centers the Black enslaved body, demonstrates the kind of intellectual ride that we are going to be taken on as we read this book. Laura's book eschews the traditional chronological or life cycle approach that's been taken by the vast majority of biographers, and instead very successfully turns the inescapable discussion of the female body into a centering device in her study of Mathilda of Flanders. And as we shall no doubt hear today, she moves from blood, describing Mathilda's origins and upbringing, through discussions of Mathilda through her busy hands, her acquisitive yet generous fingers, her crowned head, her overflowing womb, and justice dispensing mouth, ending with a discussion of her corpse as she has been interred and remembered. So I was utterly gobsmacked by Laura's success with this approach. And so I thought that rather than simply narrating Laura's career path and accomplishments leading up to our gathering here today, I am going to try something different. We are going to embody Laura. Okay. So she starts with blood. And if you know Laura, you will not be surprised at her Midwestern common sense roots. This is upper Midwestern place where we celebrate on our best days common sense, and we mind our own damn business. And after being raised in Dayton, Ohio, with the kind of religious upbringing that equips a medievalist to do really good biblical studies, she also went on to earn her PhD at Fordham University, studying with Dr. Pamela Scheingorn. But early on, Laura became an academic stepchild of Warren Hollister, who met her when she was a beginning graduate student and was utterly enthralled with her work from day one. In fact, Warren met Laura at an early meeting of the Haskins Society and then brought me to her and said, "You're both working on Queens named Mathilda." I was working on Mathilda Scotland. She was working on Mathilda Flanders, even at that early date. And Heather Tanner was there, who was also doing I think it was her master's thesis or dissertation on Mathilda Boulogne. Warren then nicknamed us, do you remember, Laura? We were the Mod Squad. I'd hoping you'd forgotten that one. He called us that for the next 10 years. So that's her blood here. Hands. Mathilda of Flanders built monasteries, churches, and ships. Laura builds overlapping networks. Her academic circles include not only Anglo-Norman scholars, but also the Queenship community, documentary cultural people, and students of monasticism. And I'm going to add that she is at the very center. She is the very center of each of these nodes because she is extremely generous with her time and her expertise. I'm personally looking forward to the imminent release of the volume that she edited with Charles Inslee, who's also here today, Gender, Memory, and Documentary Culture. For fingers, I'm going to bring in the scholarly work that has emerged from those fingertips over the years, which includes the book I just mentioned, the one we're celebrating today, and dozens of articles and book chapters on Holy Trinity Caen and various aspects of Mathilda's career. And of course, all of us are indebted to Laura for her role as editor of the Haskins Society Journal from 2013 to 2022. Moving to the head, although Laura has been known to don a crown or a tiara from time to time, and I have receipts, I'm devoting this section to the academic offices that she's held. In addition to her position as Associate Professor of History at SUNY Cortland, she currently serves as a series editor of medieval documentary cultures for Boydell and Brewer and the North American Vice President of the Haskins Society. She's also been the holder of a variety of prestigious fellowships, including 2 summer research residencies at the Université de Caen, a Franklin Library grant from the American Philosophical Society, and a visiting fellowship at the John Rylands Manuscript Library. Now, I was going to leave womb out, except I live in a state where my senator just recently encouraged us all to step aside and raise our children. And so I just had to mention that between all of this, I've already mentioned Laura and her husband, Kevin, have managed to raise 2 delightful young men, Will and Alex, who I can attest are not feral in the least. She actually put in the work. And finally, Laura Mouth, it's represented in her many conference presentations, as well as her award-winning teaching and mentoring. And finally, we get to her corpse, which hopefully will be an addendum to this introduction after many, many years. So I'm going to turn this over to Laura.
Wow. I love the wrap up with the corpse. It's a little dark, but I'm oh, Lois,
it's Halloween, Laura.
I know it's the season. I've forgotten all about the Mod Squad. Wow, that's terrific. It takes me back. Thank you. What a generous introduction. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to live up to all this hype, but I appreciate it very much. And let me just say for the rest of you who are here, Lois has been one of my staunchest supporters from time out of mind. We were just talking about our relationship that has gone on now for close to 40 years. We've been friends, and she has been just the wind beneath my wings, Lois. In so many different ways. So thank you for that. Wow, that is a terrific introduction. And thank you for centering on the body. So thanks again very much to Lois for that terrific introduction. You're all about to find out what she's talking about with these body parts that she's mentioning, but it does fit in beautifully with the theme for the night, which is embodying conquest. Thanks so much, Katherine, for inviting me to take part in this inaugural version of the European global end of the History Lab. I'm very excited that I can be part of that. So thanks so much. And again, of course, Lynn Ann, our stalwart, our wonderful aid in all things tech and all things just, organizational. So thank you. Thanks everybody for this. So I want to talk a little bit about the research that I've done. I've got this opportunity to talk about my book, which I'm very excited about. The book is coming out. It's available for order in January from Boydell and Brewer Press. But I want to talk a little bit about elements of the book that I think are important, and then I want to leave some time for question and answers because I can't really cover the whole thing in a short conversation with you tonight. But I do want to talk about it, and I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. And I will give you my cool little PowerPoint presentation if I can find it. Of course, this isn't going to work. All right, I'm going to have to try again. Hold on, everybody. So I will talk a little bit about why Mathilda, why am I doing this? Who is this woman and why is she worthy of study? So Mathilda of Flanders, her husband has been very famous for many years. Her husband is William the Conqueror, and she is, however, a part of the 11th century that has been actually ignored to some degree. And I'm going to pop this open, if you'll excuse me for the slideshow business. I love the way this doesn't let me get to my toolbar. Hold on just a second. There we go. Good. There we are. Oops. So before we talk about the book in particular, I want to talk a little bit about how I met Mathilda, who she is, and why she's important. So when I was in graduate school, one of the big sort of watershed events that we learned about for Northern European history was the Norman Conquest. And when I met Mathilda of Flanders in graduate school, it was in the midst of learning about Northern European events more generally. And the Norman Conquest was one of these supposedly watershed events that would affect the politics in Northern Europe for hundreds of years to come. When I was at Fordham as a graduate student, it seemed that there were lots of different angles from which the conquest of England by the Normans was examined. Some of them were political, some of them were economic. They studies that talked about sort of troop movements and how important it was that the Normans brought horses over the sea, whether or not the literature had changed. Was the Norman conquest something that was a crisis for the English? Was it change? Was it continuity? It seemed like every angle possible of the Norman conquest had been examined and pored over and thought about. But there was a void, this sort of Matilda-shaped blankness when it came to the very woman who stood at the head of this Norman dynasty, this Norman administrative sort of machine that had overrun England and that would be so important in the hundreds of years to come. The one element missing, the one lacuna, if you will, was this blankness where Mathilda should have stood. That was striking to me. It seemed shocking, even bizarre, kind of outrageous, that the one person who was at the linchpin of this family and indeed of this administration would be absent from scholarship, would be absent from everywhere. So when I was in graduate school, this struck me. As I dug around to find her, I realized what the problem was. The narrative sources of the 11th and 12th century that were the easiest to access, that were the easiest to read, really glossed over her pretty thoroughly. She was a bit player in their narratives of what happened in the Norman conquest. The little bits and pieces I heard, though, were fascinating. The fact that her marriage to William was banned by the papacy before it even took place, and that ban didn't seem to stop her at all. She still married William the Conqueror, and for another 10 years, their marriage was banned by the papacy through a succession of maybe 6 different popes. I thought to myself, what kind of woman has the fortitude, or maybe even just the attitude, to allow this to roll off of her back, to just sort of keep going? That was really incredible to me. So these bits and pieces then were all I could find in the beginning of my career as a graduate student. Pretty soon it became clear, however, that if you looked at the documentary evidence, if you looked at the charters, if you looked at the acts of government, she was everywhere. She signed everything. So while the narrative sources of that period were really quiet about her, the documentary sources, the acta, the diplomas, the charters, and the monastic sources, the records of her gifts, the records of her presence, she was everywhere, hiding in plain sight. So as I dug a little deeper, it seemed clear to me that this was a person whose life was worth examining and whose story was worth telling. In some ways, I feel really fortunate that she was so hard to find, because honestly, if she hadn't been so difficult to find, someone else would already have written a scholarly biography of her, and I would be out of luck. So lucky me. So I want to move then toward the structure of the book that Lois mentioned earlier. And I'm just going to throw up here my, very boring, perhaps, table of contents just to, here, let me move this out of the way, to give a sense of what it is that I'm trying to do. There's this little guy. Hold on a second. Can you guys see this all right? There we go. So the table of contents isn't that important, except for it sort of gives you a sense of the structure of my book. So as Lois alluded to, and as she used me as an object of the same kind of analysis, which I loved, you will note that the chapters of this biography are not really what you would normally expect from a biography of a queen. And we have many examples of fantastic biographies that are chronologically based. Lois wrote one of them, and there are a lot of people, Miriam Shaddis and others on this call, who have written fantastic biographies of medieval queens that have a structure that's chronological. It's the most natural thing in the world to start from the early days of a woman's life and trace it all the way to the end, using that life cycle strategy. But the reason for the structure, the reason I've decided to do something quite different, is because it felt to me that Mathilda especially, and I think medieval women and women even today, are often not well served by a structure that really describes them relationally. So instead of someone who is the daughter of, and the wife of, and the mother of, and the sort of consort of, I wanted to do something different that would center Mathilda's actions instead of her relations. Medieval men, ruling men, aren't really treated in that way. William the Conqueror really isn't thought of as the son of someone, and the husband of someone, and the father of someone, and the widow of someone. We don't classify men that way when we think about biography. And while those networks are there, they play a minor part in the sort of robust action that men are given agency for. So this structure, this layout, is an attempt, in a way, to focus on Mathilda's actions. And it's maybe a little bit paradoxical to do this body centrality, but I think it helps me focus on what Mathilda does, her actions, her hands, her fingers, her mouth. These create and move and proclaim things. The actions she takes, the things that she makes, these form the core of my story about her. And all of this action then was to push the victory of the Norman conquest along, her conquest, the conquest of her family and herself as the ruling woman of that dynasty. So those are the core of her story: the activity, the governance, the administration, the way she practices her authority actively through the work of her hands, through the work of her fingers, through the work of her mouth and other parts. These form her story. But there's more to the embodiment idea than simply centering this on her body. the embodiment that's part of my title, Embodying Conquest, also signals how adept Mathilda was at sort of extending herself through the things she created and the things she gifted to other people that represented her. So I think Mathilda pushes open the door to places that are not usually accessible to women, even royal women, through the things she made and gave that signified her. So I think through a lot of this, she creates opportunities to reach into places that her actual body couldn't go. In a minute, I'm going to talk about the ship she commissions for William, and that's one really good example of this. It crosses the channel to the battlefield at Hastings, to the shores of Pevensey, a place where she couldn't go, but it extended her presence, the reality of her, into this space. And now I'm going to show you a slide. So this here, I'm going to go ahead and start and talk a little bit about the ship that Mathilda has commissioned and gives to William, her husband, the ship that carries him over to England at the Conquest. And here is a manuscript we're looking at together, and I'm just going to look at it super quickly. I'm just going to show you the section that talks about Mathilda. But this is Oxford Bodleian Library E, Museo 93, and this is folio 15 verso. And right here, I'm going to put my cursor down. I don't know if you can see, but right here, this M is where Mathilda's section starts. Now, this is a ship list, a list of all of the people who donated ships to the cause of the Norman Conquest. This is a manuscript that was made in Normandy, that's created in Fécamp, which is a monastery in Normandy. But you'll notice where the M starts, right? All of these other people are giving William ships, but Mathilda's ship is described in great detail at the bottom of this manuscript. I'm just going to read what it says to you in English. The Duke's wife Mathilda, who later became queen, in honor of her husband, had a ship prepared called the Mora, in which the Duke went across. On its prow, Mathilda had fitted a statue of a little child who with its right hand pointed to England, and with its left hand held a little ivory horn to its mouth. And for this reason, the Duke granted Mathilda the earldom of Kent. So Mathilda commissions the warship that took William across the English Channel to invade England, and she called it the Mora, which probably means something about the fates. Elizabeth Van Houts did an examination of this, and that's what she found. So even more fascinating, though, than her commissioning the lead warship in the invasion is the decoration, the figurehead that she puts on its prow. And this is here sort of an illustration of it from the Bayeux Tapestry. It is it's an embroidery. So for those of you who don't know the Bayeux Tapestry at all, it is a 70-meter long embroidery that describes the events before and after the Norman Conquest. And in some ways, it gives us evidence for things that we don't know in other contexts. In this moment, in this instance, it actually backs up and supports the evidence that we find in that ship list. So there is our little child with the horn at its lips, and it's sort of pointing with that little gonfalon to England. Humans as sort of ship figureheads are not normal in this 11th century period. This is really an unusual figurehead to put on the prow of a ship. And it's more than, in this case, just a decoration. Mathilda, at this moment in her life, is pregnant with Adela of Blois, who would be born. Adela is her 8th out of 9 children. So Adela is right now, in this moment of the conquest, Mathilda is heavily pregnant with Adela, her 8th child. This, to me, indicates something about this ship, about this human figure that she has placed on it, the ship that she commissions herself. Using this rather intentionally to reference her own body, to reference the child within her own body. And because of this sort of humanoid element of this figurehead, I think it's very suggestive of her own presence in that moment as the ships sailed across the channel to England. By using this device, by creating and commissioning this ship, Mathilda allows herself to be present in this moment of conquest, in this moment of Norman invasion. She can't go herself. She is great with child, but she finds a way to put herself into this space where she's not supposed to be. As a Duchess of Normandy, she's not sailing herself across the channel to invade England, but she makes sure that there is something of her in that action, something that references her body explicitly through referencing the child, William's child, that she's carrying. This is one of those moments where I feel that exhibits and sort of demonstrates Mathilda's real understanding and grasp of how to use embodiment, of how to stretch herself into places that she's not really supposed to be. So this is one of those really interesting moments where you can see Mathilda very intentionally presenting herself, pushing herself into spaces like this. Hold on just a minute. Oops, I'm not done. So I want to go on from there and talk about another example of sort of Mathilda's type of embodiment. And in this particular case, I want to talk about her royal coronation. So the information we just talked about is in the chapter on her hands, that's chapter 2. And we talk about the worship. We also talk about her monastery that she has built, connected to the fact that her marriage was banned by the papacy in 1049. She builds that monastery supposedly in penance to get the papal approval that she and William wanted. However, very quickly into the construction of her monastery, the idea of the invasion of England becomes current. So she changes her idea, changes her ideology when she's building her monastery and actually links it to the conquest of England before that's even accomplished. So she's taking chances in a way on the success of the conquest by linking her monastery that she's spent so much time and energy building to that military invasion. And I'm not going to talk about that in detail, but there's a lot there. So if you have questions about that in the question and answer time, I'm happy to answer those questions. So I want to move ahead a little bit and give another example of the ways in which Mathilda's sort of embodiment is a part of this book. In that example I just gave you, Mathilda uses sort of a humanoid figure to sort of embody her and her body as an element, as an item that is sort of sent over the water. But in this case, I want to talk a little bit about her coronation in the ways that her body itself embodies or represents Norman dominance over the English. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background about that because her coronation has to be viewed in the context of William's coronation, which was actually an absolute disaster. So in 1066, William and the Normans conquer England. He's crowned on Christmas Day. And unfortunately, for reasons that I'll explain if you'd like, his service of coronation is interrupted by violence by his own soldiers who are convinced that he is being attacked within the church in Westminster. So he's interrupted. This ceremony is sort of suddenly everyone who's attending it is shocked and horrified, and everyone sort of runs out of the church, and he is sort of left there to finish up his coronation with the 2 archbishops who are there. That is Christmas of 1066, and it is a memory, apparently, in some ways, that Mathilda was trying to overwrite. Her coronation happens 2 years later in 1068, and it becomes this sort of flashpoint because she's given it so much time and energy, and she introduces elements that unfortunately seem designed to enrage the leftover bits of the English aristocracy that are still in Normandy and trying to make a go of it after the conquest is over. So the coronation, once again, is unusual for a couple different reasons. One of the main reasons is because Mathilda is once again pregnant. She's pregnant with her last child, Henry I. She is probably about 6 months pregnant, and she is probably pretty great with child. So she's probably 6 months pregnant. She is what we call a multiparous person. A multiparous woman is someone who has had multiple children. This is now her 9th child. And the reason that's kind of important is because it is a very visible pregnancy for really everyone who is present at that inauguration. So the issue here is that she is becoming crowned as the Norman new queen, the Conquest Queen of England, and she's walking through her coronation heavily pregnant with yet another heir of Normandy. So for the English who are there, this is not a pleasant sight. This is something that they are horrified by. So 2 years later, the conquest has changed everything for the English aristocracy. It has changed their language. It has changed their culture. And as the losing side of the conquest, they are sort of trying to hold on to what is left of their aristocracy and get by somehow with these new Norman overlords, at which Mathilda is the head. So she chooses very carefully some of the elements of this coronation. One of the first things she chooses is its date. She chooses Pentecost, which is an incredibly important date in the church calendar. It also involves an overnight vigil. So there are only really 3 elements, 3 times in the church calendar where you'll have an overnight vigil connected to a holiday, a high holy day: Christmas and Easter and Pentecost. Easter is tough because you're sort of, you're paralleling with Christ. It's hard to beat Christ, and you don't really want to be in competition with that. But Pentecost is one of those holidays that includes a vigil the night before, so she can stretch out her coronation and make it longer and more heavy with meaning, more weighted with meaning. Pentecost also uses particular verses for its service that were typical and traditional to use at the Pentecost vigil in particular. These Bible verses are found in Baruch 9. They are incredibly interesting verses in light of the defeat of the English just 2 years before. And this event, which is a celebration of Norman victory, and particularly of Mathilda's rule over the conquered English. And I'm going to use this verse. I'm going to read it to you. This is just one small piece of part of this Pentecost night vigil that she is going to have read over her, sort of in the gloom and the dark of this vigil the night before she is going to be crowned Queen of England. And here are some of the verses, a real short passage. Think about the English when you hear these verses. There were giants, those renowned men, that were from the beginning, of great stature, expert in war. The Lord chose not them, neither did they find the way of knowledge. Therefore did they perish. And because they had not wisdom, they perished through their folly, and other men took their place. As the English heard these verses read, you can imagine their response. They had seen their brothers and sons and husbands die in the Norman conquest of England. And now this new Norman countess would be their queen, a countess heavy with child, another Norman heir to rule over them. Not surprisingly, this was not a sight that encouraged English cooperation. Their last acknowledged king and queen, Edward the Confessor and his wife, Queen Edith, had been barren. They had had no children at all. And in fact, the crisis, if you will, of English rule was tipped off by the fact that King Edward and Queen Edith had no natural heir, no heirs of their own body. As the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy then, what was left of it, looked on, they were reminded very viscerally, very physically, that their English royal house had died out without heir. Here was Mathilda, another child, a ninth child, another Norman heir. As it turns out, little did anyone know, Henry I, who would indeed rule England and Normandy. So there are lots of interesting elements here about this coronation. Matilda's coronation also featured a special new acclamation. It was called a laudes. A laudes acclamation was sort of a call and response where a ruler would be standing to receive the acclamation. The archbishops would shout out and the priests would shout out a sort of catalog of saints that would be called upon to support this person's royal rule. Acclamations like this were really nothing new. They took place in lots of royal instances. The kings of France used them. So it's not unusual to have that kind of acclamation. The difference here was that the audience that was made up of probably equal parts Norman aristocrats and English aristocrats. The audience members were forced to participate. The call and response wasn't just from priest to priest in this instance. The call and response was priest to audience. So not only was then Matilda celebrated by the archbishops and the priests around her, but the priests imposed upon the crowd the obligation to respond and acclaim her as well. To the Normans, this must have been a very exciting and triumphalist moment. It's a moment where they could see their queen in glory and shout their acclamation of her and know what it meant to have yet another generation of Norman rulers after her, seeing her in this pregnant state. But to the English who were left over, the imposition of this acclamation was very different. They are not interested in acclaiming this Norman countess who would now be their queen, who spoke Norman French instead of Old English, who had a very different way of ruling even than their previous queen, who was almost embarrassingly fertile in comparison to their English queen who was barren. This kind of embodiment of the Norman dynasty then did not go unnoticed by the English. And in fact, almost immediately after her coronation, the very first organized real rebellions since the conquest started snapping up all over England. So the English aristocracy, leaving Matilda's incredibly triumphalist right, in which she was heavy with child, crowned in front of them, in which they were sort of forced to acclaim her, they immediately left that ceremony and organized rebellions in different places all over England. And indeed, oh, that's my phone, I'm sorry. And indeed, the next few years were spent, I'm going to do something about this, sorry. There we go. I thought that would not ring. And indeed, the next few years of the administration were spent putting out the fires of English rebellion across England. Those early rebellions, those first rebellions, were dealt with pretty humanely. But the response to them included building new castles, putting together new lordships that enshrined Norman power, handing over other lands to Normans that had once been in English hands. And there was a sort of chill, a further chill in the relationships between those Anglo-Saxon nobles, those English nobles who were trying very hard to get along with their new Norman overlords and that Norman authority. So very quickly then, the tenor of the relationship between these two aristocracies darkened and chilled. In a way, Matilda's coronation was almost too successful. It made too much of her power over her new subject people. It gave her the kind of divine status, of course, that coronations and anointing give all royal rulers. So that was nothing new. As an anointed queen, she now was a persona mixta. She was sort of this half divine, half human person, and her rule was ordained by God. But that was nothing new for the English. That was something they understood very well. Their queens were anointed too. The difference was, in this particular case, that a foreign queen was coming to rule over them, and that she was almost extravagant in the way in which she reminded them of their defeat. So Mathilda's embodiment then can be seen in different layers. On the one hand, she created things, commissioned things, donated things that brought her into places where she couldn't be herself. Another kind of embodiment you can think of for Mathilda is the ways in which she embodied the Norman dynasty herself. And I'm going to use one more example tonight, since we have some time, to talk about this embodiment question. And I hope that I'm not going to lose you all, because it's all about Eucharistic theology. So hold on to your hats. So the 11th century, when Mathilda is active, is this moment in church history where the primary ritual of the Christian church, the Eucharist, people call it communion, giving the body and blood of Christ at the altar rail, this primary and central moment in the Christian religion has become the center of heated and great debate. The debate centers around, what are those elements? What is that wine? What is that bread that is so central to the sort of Christian belief system? When you have that communion served to you, what is it that you are eating? Mathilda's own Archbishop Lanfranc was the proponent of a very radical position. And that radical position was this, that little piece of bread and that cup of wine, those were actually the flesh and blood of Christ in reality on the altar. So the sort of bloody hunk of flesh, speaking of Halloween, and the blood of Christ were there in their true nature. However, Lanfranc said, the faithful are given another miracle of concealment. So the faithful see a chalice of wine and a hunk of bread as a favor so that we wouldn't be horrified, so that we wouldn't be frightened. There's this cloaking miracle that comes along with the miraculous presence of Christ's real body and Christ's real blood on the altar. This very radical position, in the end, was the position that won out. Now, in the modern world, we call this transubstantiation. It's a major sort of central tenet of modern Catholicism. In the 11th century, however, there was a lot of pushback against this idea. So Berengar of Tours is the person who's usually sort of the figurehead, if you will, or the person most involved in arguing that those Eucharistic elements, that body and blood, were actually a memorial feast. They weren't actually Christ's body and blood. But Berengar lost that fight, and Lanfranc won it. Why does that matter? Well, Lanfranc is Mathilda's archbishop. She's known him for most of her adult life. Not only was he the Archbishop of Canterbury when she was Queen of England, he was also the abbot of St. Stephen's Caen while she was Duchess of Normandy. So he is one of her most familiar and stalwart churchmen and church authorities. And their relationship is quite long standing. Lanfranc is writing and proposing this sort of radical idea at the same time that he is in Caen, right down the road from Mathilda and her foundation of Holy Trinity. And his radical idea gains steam and acceptance by Northern European churches throughout. And Mathilda's court in particular is sort of the hotbed of, or at least the crucible of, this idea, this belief system. If you think about Mathilda against this backdrop, and you think about the context of this for her, it's important to know that the philosophies surrounding this radical idea had a lot of effect on her. The idea that something on the altar that signified Christ actually was Christ, not just a representation of him, but participated in his essence, is an important element of the philosophy that reigned in her court. The idea that an object wasn't just representing you, but could participate in who you were, was a truism for the 11th century Norman court, for the Anglo-Norman court. So when you think about this in terms of Mathilda, you have to think about the ways in which her gifts transmitted her presence. Those pieces that we think of as representing her in these spaces didn't just memorialize her or sort of indicate her, they actually participated in her presence. So that when that ship, the Mora, grounds up on the beach in England, that golden child doesn't just represent her in her pregnancy, it participates in her. The ways that medieval people understood this then made Mathilda's presence much stronger, much more explicit than we would normally think about in our modern world. And I'm more than willing to talk about that further in question and answer time. Medieval theology is not everybody's cup of tea. But I am going to say, I'm going to give one more example then. Having thought about that Eucharistic theology and thought about the ways in which Christ's represented sort of Eucharistic elements are no longer memorial elements, but now participate in the reality of his body and blood. Having that idea as a backdrop, I want to move forward a little bit and talk about some of her other gifts and the way that she represents herself in other spaces where she doesn't belong. So my last example is this. Mathilda dies November 2nd in 1083. And right before she dies, she creates a will and she writes out some bequests. She leaves her crown and her scepter and her horse's very fancy harness to her nuns at Holy Trinity. In a lot of ways, I think these things really speak to who she conceived of herself, the woman she conceived of herself to be, a ruling woman, constantly moving, constantly on the go. She probably crossed the channel round trip about 8 times in her life. She was constantly on horseback or moving in the governance of her realm. So she gives Holy Trinity, her monastic house, her crown, her scepter, and her horse's harness. But the next thing in her will, I think, is really the most interesting. And it made me think carefully and deeply about the ways in which she represented herself in the world. She specified that, and this is a quote from the document, "A cloth of gold from my chamber be made into a robe for a priest." This, when I read it, took me back a little. A cloth of gold from her chamber, her bedroom, is being made into a garment for a priest to wear. I thought, and I still think, this bequest deserves a lot of attention. And it also made me realize that Mathilda's gifts were almost always liturgical vestments or chalices to be used at the altar by a male priest. In this period, the Eucharist was only served by men. There could be no women behind the altar rail serving these very key elements, this real flesh, this real blood, to the communicants at the altar rail. Mathilda's vestments and chalices were gorgeous. She hired goldsmiths. She hired embroiderers. She had tons of artisans in her pay to make these beautiful gifts. So to one monastery, she gives a chasuble made of gold and pearls to be worn. She gave a cope, a chasuble so stiff with gold that it couldn't be folded. They're covered in pearls. They're encrusted in jewels. They're very obviously gifts from Mathilda herself. They're not modest pieces. They are things you trot out to be noticed. The queen gave us this gorgeous vestment covered in pearls and jewels. The donations of these vestments and liturgical objects then outweighed any other kind of movable gift that Mathilda donated to anyone. What does it mean that Mathilda gives gifts, specifically a cloth of gold from her bedroom, to clothe a male priest during Mass? I would argue, and I do actually argue, that this is a place that she can insert herself where women are not, once again, allowed to go. She commanded a place at the Eucharistic altar through these gifts, very rich, very notable, very obviously hers, in this moment where ideas about your presence are being underscored, radical ideas about what it means to be present somewhere through an object are being embraced. Mathilda is clothing these priests in gorgeous vestments in a way that makes it clear they are from her, as a way to insert herself into the all-male space of the Eucharist. And as the celebrant takes those elements, the priest is wearing Mathilda's garments. To me, this is the signal piece of how she uses embodiment to place herself into spaces where she traditionally had no business being. She's not supposed to be at the altar rail. You're not supposed to think of Mathilda when you're taking communion. When you're drinking the body and blood of Christ, she is not the person who should be serving it to you. Yet there is her garment on the priest, covered in jewels, covered in gold, clearly from her, and it is right in front of your face. That sleeve that is reaching across the altar is the sleeve that she gave, as a garment that has her presence, that represents her at that moment of Eucharistic miracle, as the body and blood of Christ is being consumed by the celebrants at that altar rail. So in this book, to wrap up a little, I've used documentary sources, I've used architecture, and the objects that Mathilda commissioned and collected to uncover the reality of who Mathilda of Flanders was. Her active rule was different and unusual and formed sort of a new political entity within that Anglo-Norman realm. The creation of that realm will affect medieval Europe for hundreds of years, at least Northern Europe, and becomes a signal moment, introducing new actors on the political stage and introducing a new culture, the effects of which would last for centuries. She imported into England a kind of queenship that was specific to her. And I'm happy to talk more about that in question and answer time. But it was crafted by her lived experience, and she is enacting queenship almost anew. She leaves behind sort of many of the English traditions that she inherited on ascending that throne as she stepped onto English soil. So she used some of those traditions and eschewed many of them. But her unique practice of queenship was robustly public. She was an active queen. She worked with new forms and traditional forms to create a queenship that was typified by active military involvement, by enacting royal justice, founding monasteries, reforming churches, and by documentary and cultural networks that were new. So she can be seen governing in all these documents and all these places, even when the sort of narrative story sources of that world seem to efface her. So her awareness of her own body, the messages her body conveyed, the ways in which she could use objects to put her in places where she would normally never have reached was an important element of that queenship. And I would make one more point before we move on. Mathilda was pregnant for great stretches of her adult life. And I think that made her keenly aware of her own body and the way that that body might be utilized. In terms of the coronation, her body was almost weaponized against her new subject people to make a statement about the legitimacy of her rule and how futile it was to fight against that rule. So in a world where authority is so often assumed to be masculine, I think Mathilda of Flanders, as a patron, as a judge, as a queen, embodied real power. And I think my book demonstrates not only that, but her really interesting and kind of canny ability to utilize representation, both through objects and through her own body, that challenged and even enraged her enemies. So in this way, I believe, I believe Mathilda embodied the conquest of England. And with that, I'm going to wrap up. So my last slide, I will share with you. And in this moment, I have to only apologize about my cheekiness, as I mentioned earlier. So there's your discount code. So the book is available only in order by January, but if you want to use this discount code, you get 35% off. So thank you, everyone, for having me, for listening to me jaw on about Mathilda of Flanders. And I would really welcome your questions. I'm going to stop sharing, but if you need the discount code, you can let me know.
Thank you so much, Laura, for fascinating talk. I am sure there are tons of questions. There is, for those who are with us today, there is a Q&A function in the chat. It's on the lower toolbar just to the left of the rightmost button, More. Q&A is right next to it. And you are more than welcome to put a question in the chat. As the questions come in, I'm more than happy to read your question for you if you would like, and even happier to invite you to unmute and ask your question of Laura yourself. So if you are thinking of your questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. And if I might take the shameless, speaking of cheeky, liberty of asking the first question while people put their questions in the chat. Oh, and I have to say, in Laura's defense, I'm the one who insisted that she put the discount on the slide and that it was not at all cheeky. Very welcome, because I look forward to reading your book. So Laura, I loved and agree with your reading of Mathilda, and you've really got me thinking about all the different ways that Mathilda herself seems to be expressing agency and a certain shrewdness in how to manipulate the imagery of her time. Like, she understands it and she knows how to deploy it. I'm wondering if, as you were writing about this, you were thinking about how to tease apart sort of Mathilda's agency from the highly contentious nature of the sources in which these are recorded, right? In which, the same events are written about in very different ways by people who are critical of William of Normandy and Mathilda, and people who are supporting them, right? So I just wondered if that's something you'd like to talk about as you were thinking about working through your documentary sources.
Thank you for that question. That's really interesting. As many people on this call will already know, the Conquest, of course, sort of initiated a raft of historical writing, some of it very critical, some of it very positive. Mathilda doesn't really show up in much of it, I have to tell you. So the real person who gives us a sense of who Mathilda was is Orderic Vitalis. And he's a chronicler that comes around a little bit later, but he has a very good source for the Norman royal family. And Samson is a monk in Orderic Vitalis's monastery. The monastery is called Saint-Avrou and is a Norman monastery. Samson, in fact, was one of Mathilda's sergeants, and he was threatened by William the Conqueror. Mathilda was caught sending arms and money to her rebellious son, and her son Robert rebelled against his own father, Mathilda's husband, and Mathilda helped him in that rebellion, sent him money, send him arms. And needless to say, William was not happy about that, but she was not interested in his opinion and refused to back down. This story of their argument over that is told by this one source, Orderic Vitalis. And Orderic's source for that story, and indeed for the Norman royal family and their hijinks, was Samson, one of the very people who delivered those shipments to her son Robert. So when her husband William the Conqueror finds out about these activities, he can't do anything to Mathilda. She refuses to back down. She does it again. But instead, he tries to blind Samson, who's sort of the head of her spy network. In order to save Samson and get him to safety, she buys his way into Orderic Vitalis's monastery at Santa Rome. And Orderic talks about him as wise and well-spoken. And he is certainly Orderic's source for much of what we know from chronicle sources about Mathilda. But sources that are either negative or highly critical about the Norman conquest don't really address Mathilda directly. And this is what I mean when I say I really had to dig to find her, because she doesn't feature in those criticisms, and she doesn't feature in the praise much either. I don't know if that's the answer that you wanted.
No, that's great. Thank you. Since we don't have any questions in the chat, would anyone like to use the hand raise function, or just we do have a question in the question and answer. William Fitzgerald, would you like to answer or ask your question?
Yes. Hello. I have a question about the when you were talking about the Eucharist and the kind of the embodiment of Christ. I'm not familiar with the theological issues during that time, but from the beginning, I learned this in Dr. Honeycutt's class, that the Christians believed already, I think, in the presence, like the actual presence of Christ in the Eucharist, like the beginnings of Christianity. So what was this new thing in the like the 11th century?
The data, that's a really good question, William, and thank you for that. The debate about the Eucharist had arisen again. So like many things, these things wax and wane. And the 11th century happened to be a moment when that debate was hot once again. So making those decisions, and in fact, I would say, and someone else can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think that's the last time that was debated. You don't see that debate coming up again after Lanfranc in the 11th century. So I would not say that it was never believed, but I would say it was necessarily an uncomplicated belief. And after Lanfranc, I think the question was settled.
Okay, thank you for that.
I would add one other thing. I would not argue that this was the first time that this was discussed, but I would argue that the churchmen who were involved in this question also happened to be very involved in the Norman royal court. So Lanfranc was just not some scholar out in the middle of nowhere putting across these theories and arguing in esoteric journals. He was a member of the administration of their court in many ways. So his ideas about sort of Aristotelian ideas about what that meant for real presence were sort of highly detailed. And there's lots of scholarship. And of course, Brigitte Bedos-Rezac is the person who's really the sort of expert on thinking about real presence and the relationship between the signified and the signifier. That relationship between the person who's being signified and the object that's signifying the person, that connection becomes immediate. There's no sort of space between those two elements. That space has shrunk to nothing. So it's not so much that the Eucharist was never discussed in this way, but the ways that Lanfranc decided to sort of build out his philosophy of this, changed the nature in lots of ways of the way medieval people thought about objects. One of the Brigitte Beddoes-Rezac, of course, is the other. Is again, I would use her research. The thing that really started the ball rolling with that research is the idea of wax seals, the ways in which wax seals become a type of, or sort of a mimetic device for the incarnation, the way that Christ enters, the way that God enters human flesh through Christ. So the seal matrix is sort of considered God the Father, and the wax is sort of considered the human Christ. And the idea of those two, the relationship between those two things as being so close, is one of the elements that sort of Lanfranc uses to build out and flesh out, if you'll pardon the pun, the idea of the relationship between the Eucharistic elements and Christ's own body. Did that help?
Yeah, that's really cool. I didn't know that.
Super exciting. You should read Brigitte Beddoes-Rezac stuff, because and your Professor Honeycutt knows all about it. So chase her down, because I'm sure she'd throw it right at you.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that. Thank you.
I really want to thank a student for asking the next question. That is excellent. We have a question from Miriam. So Miriam, if you'd like to unmute, and then maybe Lois and Charles, you want to go ahead and put your comments in the chat, and then I'll let you know when it's time to unmute, or in that question and answer.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura. This is just so exciting and interesting and amazing. So I don't remember if we talked about this before last summer, so forgive me, and you can just say you already know the answer to this question. But this business of the donation of the bedclothes, I mean, it's not just any clothes that's going up there to represent Mathilda on the altar, right? And her pregnancies that are like completely reiterating the fact that she's a carnal person, a woman, right? I wonder if you have thoughts about that, because at the same time, I think I mentioned to you one time that there's all these in Portugal, and probably in Spain too. I just know the Portuguese stuff better. All these donations of silk, bolts of silk. It's not clear, right? Like these people, I think they treasured up their silk. I think it was in their treasuries. But these women are specifically, and it's not exclusively women, but it's largely women, and largely royal women are donating chalices, right? And various Eucharistic liturgical instruments, and silk. And the silk sometimes is explicitly for capes. And now I'm thinking capes should be copes, but also sometimes it's specifically silk for capes for processions. And we know that there were these ritual processions going around all the time, and they put on silk capes. So I'm wondering, I guess my question is, one, how much of this is about her reiteration of her own maternity and sexuality through the bedclothes? On the other hand, bedclothes would be a pretty standard domestic item that, you know, Kit French talked about this for the 15th century, that women gave cloth to their churches because that's what they had control over. It wasn't because they were trying to send a message, you know, about the use of this material. But I don't know. What do you think? And I guess it could be both, right? But I would just like to hear you spin that out a little bit more. Thank you so much.
Miriam, I really appreciate that. And actually, I'm gonna say something now that Lois is probably waiting for me to say, which is this. So I think the timing of these donations is important. I think the timing of this Eucharistic debate is important. But I would say, Miriam, I would agree. I would actually say that, and I believe that women who give their textiles to sort of hang out at the site of grace, right, at the altar, I really think there is something about their presence in those moments. I mean, there's lots of really interesting, and you probably know just as much as I do, there's tons of interesting historiography about the ways in which women give textiles, right? Devotional textile bequests are something that, as you say, in the later period, is happening at a very, very modest level of society. I mean, we're talking about really middling people who don't have a lot of wealth. But I really think there's something about your little kerchief. Nicola Lowe has that great article about devotional bequests in England. And she talks about these women and their little kerchiefs that they save and they donate to the church, and then they're put on places on the altar. I think that is something that we are, that we deny or ignore at our peril. I think that women are actually interested in showing up at those sites of grace. But I will say something else, because Lois's Mathilda of Scotland becomes such a proponent of these kinds of gifts. So by the time Mathilda of Scotland appears on the scene, she has her own workshop. She's making the stuff herself. And very explicitly now, churchmen are saying, I know you can't serve Eucharist, but those bells you gave us ring every time we do the Eucharist, and we think of you. Those candlesticks you gave us, they're right on the altar. And while you're not a priest, what you've done here is a priestly function. I think that Mathilda is one of the first to make that connection, but I think it's a connection that all the queens after her are very comfortable making. And I don't think that actually we can sort of completely deny the idea that other more modest women are making that connection too. Not so much like my body, my fecund body is now in your face at the altar rail. More, I'm there too. I'm at the site of grace. I'm not a priest. I can't be a priest, but I'm there. Do you remember there are a couple really famous copes in the late Middle Ages that are just covered in heraldic devices. I'm sorry, they're not copes, they're altar cloths. And they're just covered in heraldic devices. They're just overrun with them. So that when people are at the altar rail, they're like, Henry and such, Elena gave this gift. There they are in your face. So I think, I just think that's fascinating. All right, that's all I have to say.
So we have a few questions now lining up. So thank you, Miriam. Charles, or maybe we should go to Lois, because Lois in the chat said she has a question about Eucharistic theology, and so maybe that loops together. And then we have Charles, and then Katharina has a question. So we can go in that order. Is that all right? Okay.
Okay, I did have a question about Eucharistic theology, but I want to get to, but I also wanted to point out the workshop of Margaret of Scotland.
Right.
Right? I mean, she's
Not
just
your Margaret.
yeah.
Sorry.
Mathilda too, but Margaret predates, right? Because she dies in what, 1080, I can't even remember. 10 anyway,
I'm Mathilda.
Yeah, no, Margaret of Scotland. I was just I couldn't come up with her birth date, but there's a whole chapter in there about her workshop full of chasubles and copes and all the kinds of things that she sends out all over Europe. So, yeah, she's making that connection too. But, yeah, you clarified it very well, but I kind of, in that 11th century debate, and if you're still here, William, there's a late Carolingian debate, that really sets the parameters here. You got two monks writing back and forth to each other in the 9th century, sort of about Eucharistic theology, and one of them is absolutely sure that there is no transubstantiation, that it's purely symbolic, and the other one is defending the idea of Christ's real presence. And so these two guys kind of set the terms of the debate. And then it comes up again with Berenger of Tours, who writes this thing saying, there's no real presence, and it's all symbolic. And people would say, "Are you defending Retramnus?" And he'd say, "No, because he was condemned. I'm not." And then he would go on and teach the exact same thing that Retramnus was teaching, even though he said he wasn't. And I kind of think he's the radical, not Lanfranc. I think that yeah, I do. I mean, I think he is probably going against what's the majority opinion. If they had stopped to think about it. What I think Lanfranc does really, really well is use these new tools of reason that are coming out of Italy and into Beck to actually create a philosophical, theological defense that makes sense, that actually makes sense to people. They can read it and go, oh, that's how it works. Whereas before it was just kind of murky and in the air. And so, but neither one of those, nobody was ever condemned for a Eucharistic position until after 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council, when
So didn't Berengar have to burn anything? Berengar didn't have to burn.
He's not supposed to teach it, but I mean, it's not that the doctrine is not actually set out in stone until 1215 with the Fourth Council of the Fourth Lateran. So, you know, there is room for heterodoxy up until that point, you know, slight kinds of heterodoxy, I think. But I mean, I love what Lanfranc does, but I think the real radical part is that he has new tools to write these things that just wouldn't have been available in the late Carolingian period or the last time they had that debate. And he's really good. He's really smart.
Love Lanfranc. People think he's a snark, but I really like him.
Yeah, well, yeah, both things. Yeah, so that's all I had to say. Yeah.
Thanks, Lois.
Okay, go ahead, Charles.
Yeah, so that was great, Laura. I was really excited for the book before you started talking. Now I'm really, really excited to see the book come out. It's more an observation than a question, but I mean, I know we've talked about this, but I hadn't quite got my head round until you were speaking this evening here in the UK, how radical Mathilda's coronation is, how much she flips what is, by that point, a really well-established set of rites. So I think we assume she's using the second coronation ordo, but it's her being very pregnant when she's crowned, and just how, not transgressive is the wrong word, but kind of how much that will have subverted kind of existing expectations. And there'll have been people in that audience who will have remembered Edith being inaugurated after her marriage to Edward.
Absolutely.
And the other thing, of course, is William is married when he becomes king. It's very unusual in an English context for a king to be married when he accesses the throne. So there's all sorts of things there, and I think you're absolutely right. Matilda kind of weaponizes this. I hadn't quite got my head around that. So thank you. It really, thank you.
Well, you would know English coronations much better than I would. That is for sure. That's your area. But I don't think that there was ever an English queen that was pregnant when she was crowned. So I think this was a novelty, and I do think she thought carefully about it before she, I think she was happy to be pregnant at that moment. But it was a very in-your-face inauguration.
But someone else might say, well, I'll wait till my confinement's over, then I'll be, then.
Right.
But it's the choosing to do it while you're very pregnant. Yes. And all, I think that's quite
it's a statement.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, how about Katharina? You had a question for Laura. Or we can read it in the chat.
So I think Katherine is talking about sort of the marriage date, which, this is one of the things I didn't get a chance to mention, but unfortunately the date of their marriage is up for grabs in lots of ways. So there had been, Katharina here is referencing a sort of the traditional idea of their marriage at 1050 or 1051. David Bates, in his latest biography of William, pushes that to 1052. He feels like it makes more sense at 1052. I think there are arguments both ways. I don't think we're ever going to come up with a smoking gun about the date of their marriage, unfortunately. David Bates also, by the way, there is no Lara Gathagan book without a David Bates. I will say that right now. So his publication of all the acta of the first generation of Normans, all of William I, after his coronation, all of his royal acta and diplomas and charters, the fact that those are all printed in 1998, that came out, and that changed the game for so many of us who, those weren't always accessible to us. So I will say, just, as a matter of course, that without David Bates, I would not be here. However, he typifies their relationship with the papacy and their attitude toward this papal ban as sort of not terribly worried because it's going to be okay, and no one was too upset about it, and things were in the works and it was going to work out okay. And that may be true. However, I will say this. I think it has a lot more to do with Mathilda's general sense of unflappability about papal approval. She comes from a background, her father and mother have been at war with the Salian emperors and their pocket pope, Benedict IX, for most of her adult life. Her ideas about the papacy are very different than many, many people in that period. Well, I don't know about other people's ideas, but we make assumptions about sort of this sort of papal power being something that is inviolable. I don't believe that was true at all, certainly not for Mathilda. So her parents were constantly at war with the Salian Pope. They were themselves at war with the Salian Emperor. And so I think Mathilda's father had been under interdict as well for a big chunk of time because he went to war against the Salian Emperor. I don't think Mathilda's approach to papal interdict or papal ban or disapproval was necessarily the one that we would assume for her. I think she was pretty unflappable about it. And the fact that they had, the vast majority of their children when their marriage was technically illegitimate says something about her ability to sort of, treat that with sort of a little bit of a shrug of the shoulder. I think that's something we don't think about, the way that sort of Flemish policy and papal policy had been at loggerheads for many years. So I hope that answered Katherine's question.
That's entirely consistent with the persona that you've been presenting as well. So we don't have any more questions in the Q&A, but we have a raised hand from Tony Thompson. Would Tony like to unmute and ask their question?
Yeah, I would love to. I wanted to start off by saying congratulations on the book, Dr. Gathagan. I think it's a long time coming and very excited for you.
Thank you.
Of course, you're welcome. My question goes back to just some of the work that I've done for you in the past, thinking about the wills of queens and how they can kind of highlight not only the power, but also influence that queens had just sort of generationally. So how would you say Mathilda's will juxtaposes to other wills, either after or before her?
That is an excellent question and one I cannot answer, but you know who can? Charlie Inslee, and he's right there. So English queens' wills, I am not super familiar with, except there are English wills I'm familiar with. But Charlie, do you have an answer to that question?
There's a will of Ethelfled of Dameron from the 940s. That's a very different document. Much less in the way of liturgical equipment for a start. A lot more about land and cows, if memory serves. Yes, it's in some respects it's a much more quotidian document. We do get bequests of liturgical vestments in wills, but they tend to be episcopal wills. But I've not looked at the body of wills recently, so I'm going from memory. But the one that sticks in my mind is the will of Ethelfled of Dameron from the 940s. And I'm trying to think if we have a will for Edwy's wife, Elflad. I think we do, but I would need to check that.
Lois, you do later queens, Anglo-Norman queens. What do you see? I mean, this charter that she puts together as a bequest. She doesn't say this is my last will and testament, but it is the last charter she produces, and it's one that lays out all of these bequests. So when I say it's a will, she herself, Tony, doesn't say, here's my last will and testament, but it happens to be her last charter in which she gives all of these things as a sort of final. The crown and scepter and the horse's harness kind of indicate that she knows that she's on her way out. Lois, do you have later Anglo-Norman queens who do wills like that?
No Anglo-Norman queens. I'm thinking that the first one, and I'm not sure whether it's Eleanor of Castile or Eleanor of Provence, that we have a document a will-like document, but so it would be what, the 13th century before that happens, but and maybe it's just an inventory and not a will. I really can't think, you know, in the 12th or 13th century whether we have one.
So I guess it's pretty unusual, Tony.
Miriam's got a will made in 1214. Those Portuguese, I'll tell you.
It's super interesting, and it's she's probably thinks she's dying. Everybody at court's sick. There are a bunch of people who are writing wills, and they're talking about being sick, and she's pregnant. But she basically lays out bequests to institutions, although she says her husband gets a big part of her materials and he should pay her debts, pay what she owes people. She leaves a little bit of money for the people who work for her, her court, her you know, her ladies in waiting, whatever. And she has 6 copies of it made, one of it to go in mea arca. And then the other ones go to the different institutions. So it's a really nice little document. Her husband completely revises it when she dies 6 years later. Anyway, yeah, there's a lot of references to what must have been wills or thinking of wills, but most of them are like Laura's document, where they're kind of like, here's a big bunch of things that happen, and then the person dies. But yeah.
Thanks for that question, Anthony.
Yeah, thank you for the responses. I appreciate it.
I think we have a hand raised. Jessica, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah. Hi, Laura. How are you?
I'm well, Jess. How are you?
Good. So I am thinking about the project that we did around her property ownership, and I'm curious if her giving the property away and bequeathing it to other people, if you think about that sort of in the same way as these tangible gifts that she gave, and if it had that same kind of meaning and impact as these other gifts that she gave, or if it was a, you know, completely different thing.
That's a very good question. I think the nature of those gifts is kind of different. So bequeathing land and giving land away, I think there are lots of rules that govern that, or at least traditions that govern that. She has lots of property to give away, and she does give some of it away in that will. The land that she gives away is all to Holy Trinity, her monastery, in that one document anyway, in that sort of final, that document that has that sort of sense of finality. But I do think there is a difference between those kinds of movable gifts and land. For me, from my perspective, and Rita Keene, who was on this call, and maybe she's still here, is a great person to ask about this, because she has a whole, study on gifting by queens of movable objects. And it's a little bit later than this, but it's super, super fascinating. I do think there's something personal about these movable objects, at least for her. And I think that Rita will tell you that in these larger collections of gifts, things that are almost sort of like inventories that Miriam Shadows was talking about, I think there are lots of dynastic elements at play. Rita Keene shows that, and she has this great article called Most Precious and Next Best. And she outlines this particular royal queen's will and the ways in which she hands out movable things and relics to certain people for certain reasons. And she's clearly sort of ordering them in value from highest to lowest. So it's true that movable gifts can certainly be much more sort of formal and dynastic and official too. But I think in some ways there is a difference between gifts of movable goods and land. I think there is a difference. They seem more personal to me. I can't really speak about every queen, but in this particular case, I think these are pretty personal to her. I mean, you don't just give somebody your hanging from your bedroom. I think it means something. That's what I think anyway. By the way, Jess, you show up in this book. I want you to know that.
Really? Thank you.
You're in the acknowledgements thank you section.
That's sweet.
Jess did work with me on Mathilda's land holdings. It was excellent. Oh, robes, Charlie says. there are robes in there. Great. Thank you for that.
Okay, Charles has me reading charters instead of moderating this session.
Oh,
Too
good.
distracting, too attractive. I
Curious stuff.
too
Absolutely.
fun. We're right at time. Is there anyone else with a burning question?
Ooh, burning questions.
A burning question that cannot go unanswered until January when the book comes out. Okay, if not, I would like everyone to join me in thanking our speaker, our introducer, our facilitator, for just a really job well done. Thank you everyone for coming together. It's very invigorating and exciting. Thanks so much.
Katherine, thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure. And Lois, oh, so nice to see you. And thank you for a wonderful introduction.
Oh,
That
it
was
was
very
fun. It was fun.
It's great to see you all.
Laura, I have a quick question for you if
Please,
you
I'll
want to
stay.
stay on for just a minute.